The weight of expectations. My name is Chen, and for 28 years I believed that love meant sacrifice without limits. I believed that being a good daughter meant pouring every penny I earned into my family's endless needs. That success was measured not by my own achievements but by how much I could give away. I was wrong about everything. Growing up in a modest two-bedroom apartment in Queens, I learned early that my role in the Chen family was to be the provider. My parents, immigrants from Taiwan who had arrived with nothing but determination and broken English, looked at me with eyes that held both love and expectation. My father worked double shifts at a restaurant. My mother cleaned office buildings at night. And somehow, even as a child, I understood that their sacrifices were building towards something. That something, it turned out, was me. "Sarah is so smart," my mother would tell anyone who would listen, her voice swelling with pride and pressure in equal measure. "She will be doctor, make good money, take care of family." The weight of those words settled on my shoulders like a heavy coat that I could never take off, growing heavier with each passing year. What I didn't understand then was how carefully orchestrated this burden would become. Every family decision, every financial choice, every long-term plan revolved around the assumption that I would one day become the golden goose that would solve all of our problems. My parents didn't just hope for my success, they counted on it with a certainty that would later feel suffocating. My younger brother Kevin, 3 years my junior, seemed to float through life untethered by such expectations. "Minolsa has mating, mayaowe." While I studied until my eyes burned, Kevin played video games. While I worked part-time jobs throughout high school to help with family expenses, Kevin bought the latest sneakers with money our parents somehow found for him. "Boys need different things," my mother would explain when I questioned this disparity. "You understand responsibility? Kevin is still learning." But Kevin's lack of responsibility wasn't accidental or temporary, as I would later discover. It was carefully cultivated by parents who had already decided that he wouldn't need to be responsible because his older sister would take care of everything. Every time I suggested that Kevin might benefit from having a job or contributing to household expenses, my parents would dismiss the idea. "Why stress him when you're doing so well? He has plenty of time to figure things out." The favoritism was subtle but persistent. Kevin's failures were met with understanding and excuses, while my successes were met with higher expectations and additional responsibilities. When Kevin failed his driving test 3 times, my parents paid for extra lessons and a 4th attempt. When I passed mine on the first try, they immediately began discussing how I could use my license to drive Kevin places he needed to go. Warrant. The message was clear. My achievements were tools to benefit the family, while Kevin's struggles were problems for the family to solve. I excelled academically because I had no choice. Every A was a step closer to the scholarship that would save my family. Every honor roll certificate was proof that their faith in me was justified. When I received a full scholarship to Columbia University for pre-med, my parents cried tears of joy and relief. "Now everything will be okay," my father said, his weathered hands shaking as he held my acceptance letter. What I didn't realize was that my acceptance letter was more than an achievement. It was a contract I had never agreed to sign. My parents immediately began making plans for the money I would earn as a doctor, calculating mortgage payments and retirement contributions with a precision that both impressed and terrified me. They spoke about our future and our investment in ways that made it clear that my education and career were family assets rather than personal accomplishments. College was a revelation in ways I hadn't expected. For the first time, I was surrounded by people my age who weren't carrying the financial weight of entire families on their backs. I watched my dorm mates spend money on coffee without calculating whether that $4 could have bought dinner for 2 people. I observed study groups that met purely for academic curiosity rather than desperate necessity. It was a different world, one that made me acutely aware of the invisible chains that bound me to home. My roommate Jessica, a bubbly pre-law student from Connecticut, became my window into what normal family relationships looked like. Her parents called to check on her well-being, not her grades. They sent care packages filled with her favorite snacks, not bills that needed to be paid. When she mentioned wanting to study abroad, they discussed the educational benefits rather than the lost income potential. Watching her navigate family relationships with such ease made me realize how transactional my own had become. "Your parents call you every other day to ask about money," Jessica observed after several months of living together. "That's not normal, Sarah. My parents would be mortified if they thought I felt obligated to support them financially." Her words planted seeds of doubt that would take years to fully germinate, but they marked the beginning of my awareness that perhaps my family's expectations weren't universal or reasonable. Despite the distance, the expectations followed me to Manhattan. Every phone call home included updates on family finances. Tiao, the restaurant where my father worked, was struggling. My mother's cleaning company had reduced her hours. Kevin needed money for textbooks, for a computer, for things that seemed to multiply with each conversation. "Just until things get better," became my mother's constant refrain. "You understand how important family is." But as time went on, I began to notice patterns that troubled me. The restaurant where my father worked was always struggling, but somehow my parents managed to afford new furniture, restaurant dinners, and cable television packages that cost more than my monthly food budget. Kevin's needs seemed to expand to meet whatever money was available, requiring increasingly expensive items that were supposedly essential for his education or job prospects. I understood. I sent money home religiously, even when it meant eating ramen noodles for weeks at a time. I took out additional student loans to cover not just my education, but my family's mounting expenses. My grades remained high, because failure wasn't an option, but the stress of managing my studies while financially supporting 3 other people was slowly eroding my health and my sanity. The loans were a source of particular anxiety. While my classmates borrowed money for their own education, I was borrowing money to fund my family's lifestyle. Every dollar I sent home was a dollar that would eventually need to be repaid with interest, creating a cycle of debt that seemed to stretch endlessly into my future. I calculated that by the time I finished medical school, I would owe nearly twice what my classmates owed, despite receiving the same scholarship they had. During sophomore year, I discovered something that shook my faith in everything I thought I knew about my family's financial situation. While visiting home for Thanksgiving, I accidentally opened a bank statement that had been left on the kitchen counter. My parents had over $15,000 in their savings account, more money than I had ever seen in one place. When I asked about it, my mother quickly explained that it was their emergency fund and absolutely couldn't be touched for daily expenses. "But I thought you were struggling," I said, confused. "You've been asking me for money to help with rent and groceries." My mother's face flushed slightly. "That money is for real emergencies only. We can't touch it for regular bills. You don't understand how scary it is to have no safety net when you're our age." Her explanation made some sense, but it felt incomplete. If they had $15,000 saved, why was I sending them $300 a month that I could barely afford? The cognitive dissonance between their claims of financial hardship and the evidence of their actual resources created a persistent unease that I couldn't quite shake. I began paying closer attention to their spending habits during my visits home, noticing new purchases that seemed inconsistent with the desperate financial situation they described during our phone calls. Medical school brought what I thought would be a temporary reprieve. The demanding schedule provided a legitimate excuse for less frequent communication, and my student status meant my income was limited to whatever I could make from research assistant positions. When you become doctor, everything changes, my mother reminded me during our weekly calls. Then we can really be comfortable. But even as a medical student, the financial requests continued. Kevin had decided to attend community college, which my parents assured me was a financially responsible choice that demonstrated his new maturity. However, his textbooks, supplies, and transportation costs seemed to require constant supplementation from my meager earnings. When I suggested that he might work part-time to help cover these expenses, my parents were horrified. "School is his job right now," my mother insisted. "We don't want him to be distracted like you were, working all those jobs in high school. We want him to focus on his studies." The irony that I was currently working multiple jobs to pay for both my own education and Kevin's was apparently lost on her. The phrase, "when you become doctor," became the soundtrack of my life. It was the answer to every family crisis, the solution to every financial problem, the justification for every sacrifice I made. Kevin dropped out of community college twice, unable to find motivation in his studies. "It's okay," my parents assured me. "Not everyone is like you. He will find his way when you become doctor, and can help him." Each time Kevin dropped out, my parents would develop new theories about what he needed to succeed. Maybe he was better suited for trade school. Maybe he needed to take a gap year to mature. Maybe he had undiagnosed learning disabilities that required expensive testing and treatment. Each theory came with its own set of costs, all of which were somehow my responsibility to bear. What struck me most was how my parents' expectations for Kevin continued to diminish, while their expectations for me continued to rise. Kevin's failures were met with understanding and lowered standards, while my successes were met with assumptions that I could handle even more responsibility. The double standard was so pronounced that even Kevin began to comment on it, though not in ways that suggested he wanted it to change. "You're so lucky you're smart," he told me during one of my visits home. "I wish I could just study and have everything work out like it does for you." The implication that my success was effortless, that my achievements came naturally, rather than through relentless work and sacrifice, stung more than any direct criticism could have. During my residency, the expectations intensified rather than decreased. I was finally earning a real salary, though the grueling hours meant I barely had time to spend any of it on myself. My parents had specific plans for my newfound income. They wanted to move to a larger apartment, one where Kevin could have his own room, and they could finally have the space they deserved after years of cramped living. The monthly rent would be double what they currently paid, but they assured me it was reasonable given my new earning potential. The apartment they had chosen was in an expensive neighborhood that offered amenities they had never had before. A doorman, a gym, parking spaces that cost more per month than my food budget. When I expressed concern about the cost, they reminded me that this was an investment in the family's future. "Kevin needs space to think about his career," my mother explained, "and your father and I deserve some comfort after all these years of sacrifice." I found myself sending home 70% of my income, keeping just enough to cover my own basic expenses and the minimum payments on my student loans. I lived in a studio apartment that felt more like a closet, furnished with second-hand furniture, and powered by a relentless determination to make everyone else's dreams come true. My own dreams, whatever they might have been, seemed selfish in comparison to my family's needs. The financial arrangement was unsustainable, but pointing this out was met with accusations of selfishness and reminders of family loyalty. "We're not asking for charity," my father would say whenever I expressed concerns about the amount of money flowing from my account to theirs. "This is an investment in the family. When we're comfortable, everyone benefits." But I was beginning to see that everyone didn't actually include me. My comfort was considered optional, a luxury that could be deferred indefinitely while everyone else's needs took priority. The family's financial stability was built on the foundation of my instability, a fact that became increasingly difficult to ignore. Kevin, now 25 and still unemployed, had developed what my parents generously called motivational challenges. He spent his days playing online games, and his nights going out with friends whose parents, unlike his sister, weren't funding their lifestyle. When I suggested he might benefit from therapy or career counseling, my mother became defensive. He just needs time to find himself. Not everyone can be successful like you. Family helps family. The therapy suggestion had come from Drive Martinez, whom I had started seeing to deal with the anxiety and insomnia that had become constant companions during my residency. She had listened to my family situation with a professional concern that made me realize how unusual my circumstances really were. "Sarah," she had said during one of our early sessions, "when you describe your family's financial expectations, you sound like you're talking about a business arrangement rather than a family relationship. Healthy families don't operate on the assumption that one member will indefinitely support all the others." Her words had felt like both a revelation and a betrayal. Was I wrong to question my family's expectations? 680. Was it selfish to want some financial independence? 680. Or had I been enabling a dynamic that wasn't healthy for anyone involved? During this time, I also met David, a fellow physician who worked in the emergency department at my hospital. David came from a middle-class family in Ohio, where financial responsibility was shared, and children were expected to become independent adults, rather than permanent sources of income for their parents. His perspective on family relationships was so different from mine that it initially felt foreign and uncomfortable. My parents would be embarrassed if they thought I felt obligated to support them financially, David told me when I cautiously shared some details of my situation. They want me to build my own life, not sacrifice it for theirs. That's what loving parents do. David's words echoed Jessica's observations from college, creating a chorus of voices that challenged everything I had been taught about family loyalty and obligation. But accepting their perspective meant acknowledging that my parents' love might be conditional on my financial contributions, a possibility that felt too painful to fully examine. Our relationship developed slowly, partly because I was working constantly, and partly because I was afraid to let him see how little control I had over my own life. When he suggested weekend trips or nice dinners, I had to carefully calculate whether I could afford such expenses after sending money home. The mathematics of my life were humiliating, and I became skilled at deflecting his invitations without explaining the real reasons I couldn't accept them. The breaking point came during what should have been one of the happiest moments of my life. After completing my residency in internal medicine, I had been offered a position at a prestigious hospital with a salary that would finally allow me to start paying down my debt and maybe, just maybe, begin building something for myself. The offer came with a signing bonus of $10,000, money that I had planned to use for a security deposit on a better apartment, and some basic furniture that wasn't held together with duct tape. I called home to share the good news about the job offer, expecting congratulations and perhaps acknowledgement of how hard I had worked to reach this point. Instead, my mother immediately began calculating how much additional money I would be able to send home. "With this new salary, we can finally buy the house," she announced. "Kevin and I found a beautiful place in New Jersey. 3 bedrooms, nice neighborhood. The down payment is only $60,000. The words hit me like ice water. $60,000. The amount I had managed to save over the past 2 years, every penny of which I had planned to use for my own student loan payments and maybe, eventually, a down payment on a small apartment for myself. "Mum, that's all the money I have saved," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Exactly," she replied, as if this was perfectly logical. "It's perfect timing. You can afford it now, and we really need this." Many musical grew. Your father's back is getting worse, and we need a house with no stairs. Many musical crew. Kevin needs his own space to figure out his life. Many musical crew. This is what family does for each other. What followed was a detailed presentation that my parents had clearly planned in advance. They had researched the house, calculated the mortgage payments, and even identified specific ways that my increased salary could cover not just the down payment, but the ongoing monthly expenses. They had spreadsheets. They had timeline projections. They had contingency plans that involved refinancing options and potential rental income from the basement. The level of planning was both impressive and terrifying. They had mapped out my financial future without consulting me, making assumptions about my money that felt breathtakingly presumptuous. When I asked what would happen to my own financial goals, they looked genuinely confused, orienting me. "What goals?" my mother asked. Orienting me. "You'll be living comfortably with your salary. You don't need to worry about a house right now. You're young and single. This is the time to help family." The assumption that my singleness made me available for unlimited financial exploitation stung particularly deeply. David and I had been growing closer, and I had begun to imagine a future that included marriage, children, and the kind of financial stability that would make those dreams possible. But my parents seemed to view my potential relationships as obstacles to their plans, rather than legitimate parts of my life. That night, I sat in my tiny apartment and stared at my bank statements. 28 years old, earning a six-figure salary, and I had less disposable income than most of my friends who were still paying off undergraduate loans. I thought about David, who had started talking about moving in together, and realized I couldn't even afford to split rent on a decent one-bedroom apartment. I thought about my student loans, which had been accruing interest for years while I made minimum payments because every extra dollar went home. The student loan situation was particularly galling. While my parents were asking for $60,000 for a house down payment, I owed over $200,000 in educational debt. The monthly payments on my loans were higher than most people's rent, but somehow my parents viewed their housing desires as more urgent than my actual debt obligations. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to feel angry. Not just frustrated or stressed, but genuinely deeply angry at the situation I had allowed to consume my entire existence. I was angry at my parents for seeing me as a solution to their problems, rather than a person with my own needs and dreams. I was angry at Kevin for taking advantage of everyone's low expectations while I carried the weight of impossibly high ones. Most of all, I was angry at myself for enabling a dynamic that was slowly destroying my chance at a normal, healthy life. The anger was followed by something even more powerful. Clarity. I could see my future stretching out before me, a lifetime of working to fund other people's dreams while my own withered and died. I could see myself at 50. Still single because no partner would tolerate being third priority after my parents and brother. Still living in substandard housing because every dollar went to maintain their comfortable lifestyle. Still carrying debt from my 20s because I had never been allowed to pay it off. The vision was so clear and so horrifying that it jolted me into action. I made a list of my actual financial obligations: student loans, rent, food, transportation, medical insurance. Then I made a list of my family's requests: house down payment, ongoing mortgage support, Kevin's living expenses, my parents' upgraded lifestyle. The numbers didn't just fail to add up. They revealed a system that was designed to ensure my permanent financial instability. I spent the entire weekend researching normal family financial relationships, reading articles about healthy boundaries, and calculating what my life could look like if I prioritized my own financial health. The possibilities were staggering. I could pay off my student loans in 5 years instead of 20. I could save for retirement. I could afford to date, to travel, to live in a place with adequate heat and windows that actually closed properly. But implementing these changes would require confronting a family system that had been built around my compliance and sacrifice. It would mean disappointing people I loved, weathering accusations of selfishness, and possibly losing relationships that had defined my entire life. The prospect was terrifying, but the alternative was worse. The next morning, I called my mother back. "I've thought about the house," I told her. "I can't give you the down payment money. I need it for my own loans and my own future." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "What do you mean you can't?" my mother finally asked. "Of course you can. You have the money." "Having the money and being able to spend it are two different things," I explained. "I have my own financial responsibilities that I've been neglecting for too long. I need to take care of my student loans before I can help with anyone else's expenses." What followed was the most difficult conversation of my life. My mother accused me of being selfish, of forgetting where I came from, of abandoning my family when they needed me most. She reminded me of every sacrifice she and my father had made, every dollar they had scraped together for my education, every dream they had deferred for my success. "After everything we've done for you," she said, her voice breaking, "this is how you repay us." The conversation lasted for over an hour, with my mother cycling through different emotional appeals. She tried guilt, reminding me of my parents' age and health concerns. She tried logic, explaining how the house would benefit everyone in the long run. She tried fear, painting pictures of homelessness and destitution if I didn't help. She tried bargaining, offering to reduce the amount or extend the timeline for repayment. Each approach felt like a carefully rehearsed manipulation, a tool designed to override my logical assessment of the situation and trigger my deep-seated conditioning to prioritize family needs over my own well-being. For the first time, I could see the conversation for what it was, an attempt to maintain a system that benefited everyone except me. The guilt was overwhelming, but for the first time in my adult life, I didn't immediately capitulate. Instead, I took a deep breath and said something that felt both terrifying and liberating. "I'm grateful for everything you've done, but that doesn't mean I owe you my entire life and every dollar I earn. I need to build my own future too." My father called an hour later, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Your mother is crying," he told me. "How can you hurt her like this? We raised you to care about family." The conversation with my father was more manipulative than my mother's emotional appeals. He used my love for my mother as a weapon, suggesting that my refusal to fund their house purchase was causing her physical and emotional distress. "She hasn't eaten since you called," he continued. "She's been crying all morning. She keeps saying she doesn't understand how her daughter could be so cruel." The image of my mother in distress was almost enough to break my resolve, but I forced myself to remember that her distress was about money, not love. If my refusal to give them $60,000 was enough to devastate her, what did that say about the nature of our relationship? Corey. Kevin sent a series of angry text messages that revealed more about his character than years of family dinners ever had. "You're so selfish," he wrote. "Mum and Dad sacrificed everything for you, and now you won't even help them when they need it. Yeah. You think you're better than us now that you make good money. Some sister you are." His messages continued throughout the day, each one more accusatory than the last. He called me ungrateful, spoiled, and selfish. He accused me of looking down on the family now that I was successful. He threatened to cut off contact if I didn't reconsider my decision. The threats felt both hurtful and revealing. They suggested that his relationship with me was entirely contingent on my financial contributions. For a moment, the collective weight of their disapproval nearly broke my resolve. The conditioning of 28 years doesn't disappear overnight, and every fiber of my being was screaming that I was making a terrible mistake. But then I thought about David, about the life I wanted to build with him, about the possibility of having children someday and being able to give them opportunities without sacrificing everything for myself. I thought about the vacation I had never taken, the hobbies I had never pursued, the friendships I had let wither because I was always working or worrying about money. I thought about the woman I could be if I wasn't constantly pouring myself out for other people. The vision of that alternative future gave me strength to weather the storm of family disapproval that followed my decision. But what I didn't expect was how the conflict would escalate beyond emotional manipulation into active sabotage of my relationships and career. 2 weeks after my refusal to fund the house purchase, I received a call from David. His voice was confused and hurt as he recounted a conversation he'd had with my mother. "Sarah, your mum called me," he said. "She told me some things about your financial situation that don't match what you've told me. She said you've been lying about your income and that you're secretly wealthy, but pretending to struggle so you don't have to help your family." The betrayal was breathtaking. My mother had not only contacted David without my permission, but had deliberately distorted the truth to damage our relationship. She had painted me as a liar and a manipulator, suggesting that my financial constraints were fabricated, and that my refusal to help the family was based on greed rather than necessity. "She showed me bank statements," David continued. "She said you have way more money than you've been telling me, and that you've been using fake poverty as an excuse to avoid contributing to family expenses. She's really worried about you, Sarah. She thinks you might have a gambling problem or something else that's making you lie about money." The sophistication of my mother's manipulation was stunning. She had not only contacted my boyfriend but had prepared evidence to support her false narrative. The bank statements she had shown David were probably the ones reflecting my gross income before taxes, loan payments and living expenses, creating the illusion of wealth where none existed. I spent hours on the phone with David, walking him through my actual financial situation with a level of detail I had never shared with anyone. I showed him my student loan statements, my monthly expenses, my savings account balance. I explained the pattern of family financial requests and the impact they had had on my ability to build a stable life. David was horrified, both by the extent of my family's financial control and by my mother's willingness to sabotage our relationship to maintain it. "Sarah, this isn't normal," he said. "Healthy families don't operate like this. And they certainly don't lie to their daughter's boyfriend to try to control her behavior." But my mother's interference didn't stop with David. She also contacted my workplace, calling my supervisor to express concern about my mental health, and suggesting that I might be experiencing a breakdown that was affecting my judgment. She claimed that I had been acting erratically, making poor financial decisions, and isolating myself from family who were trying to help. The call to my supervisor was particularly damaging because it came during my probationary period at the new hospital. Warrington Norsa, Dr. Rodriguez, my attending physician, called me into her office with a concerned expression that made my stomach drop. "Sarah, I received an unusual call from someone claiming to be your mother," she began. "She expressed some concerns about your mental health and suggested that you might be going through a difficult time that could affect your work performance." I was mortified. My mother's attempt to sabotage my career by suggesting I was mentally unstable felt like a complete betrayal of everything I thought our relationship meant. I had to spend an uncomfortable hour explaining the family financial conflict to my supervisor, providing context that made my mother's call look manipulative rather than caring. Rodriguez was professional, but clearly disturbed by the situation. "Sarah, I need you to know that family interference in workplace matters is a serious red flag," she told me. "This kind of behavior suggests some very unhealthy family dynamics that you might want to address with professional help." The recommendation for professional help led me back to Drive Cayetano Martinez, the therapist I had seen briefly during residency. This time our sessions focused not just on my anxiety but on the complex web of manipulation and control that my family had woven around my life. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that my situation was far more serious than simple family financial conflict. "Sarah, what you're describing is financial abuse," she explained during one of our sessions. "Your family has systematically isolated you from your own resources, manipulated your emotions to maintain control, and escalated to sabotaging your relationships and career when you tried to establish boundaries. This is not normal family conflict. This is abuse." The word abuse felt too strong at first, but the more I examined my family dynamics through that lens, the more accurate it seemed. My parents had systematically conditioned me to believe that my value as a person was tied to my financial contributions. They had isolated me from normal relationships by making my financial obligations so extensive that I couldn't afford to maintain friendships or romantic partnerships. They had escalated their control tactics when I tried to establish independence, using increasingly sophisticated manipulation to maintain their power over my life. Dr. Martinez helped me develop strategies for managing the ongoing family crisis while protecting my own mental health and career. The most important lesson was learning to distinguish between guilt and genuine moral obligation. Guilt is often a sign that you're violating someone else's expectations, she explained, but those expectations might not be reasonable or healthy. Genuine moral obligation is based on your own values and ethical principles, not on other people's demands for your compliance. Over the next few weeks, I established what felt like revolutionary new boundaries. I told my family that I would continue to help with emergencies and contribute to reasonable expenses, but that I would no longer be funding their lifestyle upgrades or Kevin's unemployment. I would send a set amount each month, enough to help, but not enough to enable. I opened a separate savings account that they didn't know about, and began automatically transferring money into it before I could be tempted to send it home. The reaction was swift and brutal. My mother stopped taking my calls. My father's conversations became stilted and brief. Kevin alternated between begging and anger, unable to understand why his personal ATM had suddenly shut down. "You've changed," my mother told me during one of our rare conversations. "Success has made you selfish. I don't know who you are anymore." But the family's reaction went beyond emotional withdrawal. They began a campaign of social manipulation, designed to isolate me from anyone who might support my decision. They contacted extended family members, painting me as an ungrateful daughter who had abandoned her parents in their time of need. They reached out to family friends from my childhood, sharing carefully edited versions of our conflict that made me look cruel and unreasonable. The extended family's response was mixed but mostly supportive of my parents. My Aunt Linda, my mother's sister, called to express her disappointment in my behavior. "Your parents sacrificed everything for your education," she told me. "The least you can do is help them buy a house. You make more money than the rest of us combined. How can you be so selfish?" The conversation with Aunt Linda revealed how effectively my parents had managed the family narrative. She had no idea about the extent of my student loan debt, the amount of money I had already sent home over the years, or the ongoing financial support I continued to provide. In her mind, I was a wealthy doctor who was refusing to help struggling parents out of pure selfishness. I tried to explain my perspective, but Aunt Linda had already made up her mind. "Family is family," she said dismissively. "Money comes and goes, but family is forever. You'll regret this when your parents are gone." The conversation ended with her suggestion that I search my heart and remember what really mattered in life. Similar conversations played out with cousins, family friends, and even some of my parents' neighbors who had been enlisted in the campaign to pressure me into compliance. Each conversation followed the same pattern: expressions of disappointment, reminders of family loyalty, and suggestions that my refusal to fund the house purchase was evidence of moral failure. The social pressure was intense and emotionally exhausting. I began to understand how effectively my family had positioned themselves as victims, and me as the villain in this story. Their narrative was simple and compelling. Hard-working immigrant parents were being abandoned by their successful daughter who had forgotten her roots. My narrative was more complex and harder to explain. A daughter was trying to establish healthy boundaries after years of financial manipulation and control. The complexity of my situation made it difficult to defend, especially in brief conversations with extended family members who had limited information and strong opinions. How do you explain financial abuse to someone who sees only a wealthy doctor refusing to help struggling parents? How do you describe emotional manipulation to people who have been manipulated themselves? During this period, I also discovered that my parents had been misrepresenting their financial situation to the extended family just as they had been misrepresenting it to me. When I mentioned my mother's savings account to Aunt Linda, she was shocked. "What savings account?" she asked. "Your mother told me they live paycheck to paycheck and can barely afford groceries." The revelation that my parents had been lying to multiple family members about their finances suggested a level of deception that went far beyond simple wishful thinking. They had created different stories for different audiences, carefully managing information to maximize sympathy and support for their position. I began to wonder what other aspects of my family's financial narrative were fabricated or exaggerated. If they had hidden assets from me and lied about them to other family members, what else might they be hiding? The possibility that I had been systematically deceived about the extent of their need made me question everything I thought I knew about our family dynamics. 3 months after my initial refusal to fund the house purchase, the truth began to emerge in unexpected ways. Kevin, apparently frustrated by the ongoing family conflict, made a drunken confession during one of our rare phone conversations. "You know what's really messed up?" he slurred. "Mum and Dad have been planning this house thing for over a year. They've been saving money and looking at properties since before you even finished residency. They already have most of the down payment. They just wanted you to pay for it so they could keep their savings." The revelation was staggering. My parents hadn't just asked me to fund their house purchase, they had manipulated me into believing they needed my money when they already had the resources to buy the house themselves. The elaborate presentation about mortgage calculations and financial necessity had been theater designed to extract money from me that they didn't actually need. Kevin's confession continued with additional details that painted an even more disturbing picture. "They've been telling everyone how much money you make and how you should be helping more," he said. "Mum keeps spreadsheets of your salary and calculates how much you should be sending home. She thinks you're being greedy by keeping so much for yourself." The image of my mother maintaining spreadsheets of my income and calculating appropriate tribute amounts was both absurd and frightening. It suggested a level of entitlement to my earnings that went far beyond normal family support. I wasn't a daughter in their minds. I was a resource to be optimized and exploited. "And the whole thing about my education costs," Kevin continued, his words becoming more slurred but his meaning increasingly clear. "Mum and Dad never actually expected me to succeed in school. They just wanted another excuse to ask you for money. Every time I dropped out, they were secretly relieved because it meant they could ask for more money for the next attempt." This revelation was perhaps the most painful of all. My parents had never actually invested in Kevin's education or believed in his potential for success. They had used his the weight of expectations. Part 2. This revelation was perhaps the most painful of all. My parents had never actually invested in Kevin's education or believed in his potential for success. They had used his repeated failures as a convenient excuse to extract money from me, knowing that my sense of family loyalty would make me feel obligated to fund his endless second chances. Kevin's lack of motivation wasn't accidental. It was profitable for my parents. The really messed up part, Kevin continued, his inhibitions completely dissolved by alcohol, is that they've been planning to ask you to support them in retirement too. They figure you'll be making so much money as a doctor that you can basically fund their whole lifestyle. They've never saved for retirement because they assume you'll take care of everything. The scope of my parents' long-term financial planning around my income was breathtaking. They hadn't just failed to plan for their own retirement, they had actively avoided it, counting on my future earnings to fund their golden years. I was not just their current ATM, I was their entire retirement strategy. Kevin's revelations continued for another 20 minutes, each confession more damaging than the last. He told me about conversations where my parents had discussed how to maximize the money they could extract from me, strategies for making me feel guilty when I resisted their requests, and backup plans for maintaining financial control even if I got married or had children. "They're really mad about your boyfriend," Kevin said near the end of our conversation. "They think he's going to turn you against the family and make you keep all your money for yourself. Mum has been trying to figure out ways to break you guys up so you'll stay focused on helping us." The confirmation that my mother's call to David had been part of a deliberate strategy to sabotage my relationship was both validating and horrifying. I had suspected manipulation, but hearing Kevin describe it so casually made it clear that my parents viewed my personal happiness as an obstacle to their financial goals. After Kevin's confession, I spent several sleepless nights processing the full extent of my family's deception and manipulation. The people I had loved and sacrificed for had never seen me as a person with my own needs and dreams. I was a resource to be exploited, a solution to problems they didn't want to solve themselves, a retirement plan that allowed them to avoid taking responsibility for their own financial future. The anger I felt was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It wasn't the hot, explosive anger of a moment of betrayal. It was the cold, deep anger of someone who had spent years being systematically deceived and exploited by the people who were supposed to love and protect her. This anger didn't fade with time. It crystallized into a clarity that would reshape every aspect of my life. I confronted my parents with Kevin's revelations during a phone call that I recorded with their permission, ostensibly for my own records, but actually because I suspected they would deny everything. The conversation was even more revealing than Kevin's confession had been. My mother's initial response was to deny everything, but when I pressed her with specific details that Kevin had provided, her story began to change. "Well, of course we've been planning for the future," she said defensively. "That's what responsible parents do. We've always assumed you would want to help us when you were successful. That's what good children do." The casual admission that they had built their entire financial future around my income, without ever consulting me or considering my own needs, was delivered as if it were the most natural thing in the world. In their minds, my success was a family asset that they had every right to access and control. "Sarah, you have to understand," my father interjected, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when explaining something he thought I was too naive to grasp. "We invested everything in your education. We sacrificed our own comfort, our own dreams, our own financial security. It's only fair that we should benefit from that investment now that it's paying off." The language of investment and return on investment was particularly chilling. They had literally calculated the cost of raising me and expected profits based on my lifetime earnings. I wasn't their daughter. I was their most successful business venture. "Besides," my mother added, her voice becoming more manipulative, "family money is family money. What you earn belongs to all of us, not just you. We're not asking for charity. We're asking for our fair share of what we helped create." The concept of fair share was particularly galling, coming from people who had hidden their own assets while claiming financial desperation. I asked directly about the savings account I had discovered, and my mother's response revealed the depth of their entitlement. "That money is for our real emergencies," she said, as if this explanation made perfect sense. "We can't touch that for regular expenses or house purchases. That's what your money is for. You don't have any real financial responsibilities yet, so you can afford to help with these things." The dismissal of my student loans, my own housing costs, and my need to save for my own future as not real financial responsibilities was breathtaking. In their minds, my obligations to them superseded any obligations I might have to myself or my own future. The conversation continued for over an hour, with my parents alternating between guilt trips, logical arguments, and increasingly desperate emotional appeals. They tried to convince me that my refusal to fund their house purchase was a temporary rebellion that I would eventually outgrow. They suggested that my boyfriend was manipulating me into abandoning my family. They hinted that my selfishness might have spiritual consequences, and that I was violating the principles they had raised me to believe in. But the most revealing moment came when my father, apparently frustrated by my continued resistance, said something that exposed the true nature of our relationship. "Fine, Sarah. If you want to be selfish, that's your choice. But don't come crying to us when you need help someday. Family loyalty works both ways, and if you can't help us when we need it, don't expect us to be there for you." The threat was clear. My parents' love and support were conditional on my financial compliance. If I didn't continue funding their lifestyle, they would withdraw their emotional support and cut me off from the family. The relationship I had thought was based on love was actually a business transaction with very specific terms and conditions. What exactly are you saying, Dad? I asked, wanting to make sure I understood the implications of his threat. "I'm saying that children who don't take care of their parents don't deserve to be taken care of by their parents," he replied, his voice cold and final. "You can choose to be part of this family or not, but if you choose not to help us, then you're choosing not to be our daughter." The ultimatum was both liberating and devastating. On one hand, it clarified the nature of our relationship and freed me from any remaining guilt about establishing boundaries. On the other hand, it confirmed that the people I had loved and sacrificed for were willing to disown me if I stopped being profitable. I ended the conversation with a clarity I had never felt before. "Then I guess I'm choosing not to be your daughter," I said, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Because I'm definitely choosing not to fund your lifestyle anymore." The silence that followed was profound. After a moment, my mother's voice came through the phone, high and disbelieving. "You don't mean that," she said. "You're just upset. You'll change your mind when you calm down." "No, Mum, I won't," I replied. "I've been calm for weeks while I figured out what was really going on here. This isn't an emotional decision. It's a logical one, based on information I should have had years ago." I hung up the phone and sat in my apartment, feeling simultaneously empty and free. The family I had thought I was fighting to save had never actually existed. The people I had been supporting had never actually needed my support. The love I had been trying to earn had never actually been available, no matter how much I sacrificed. The weeks that followed were among the most difficult and transformative of my life. My parents made good on their threat to cut me off from the family, but their version of cutting me off revealed how shallow our relationships had really been. They stopped calling, but since our conversations had always centered around money, there wasn't much to miss. They stopped inviting me to family gatherings, but since those gatherings had always included requests for financial assistance, the absence was actually a relief. Kevin's response was more complex. He continued to contact me, alternating between anger and attempts at reconciliation. Sometimes, he would call to berate me for destroying the family. Other times, He would call to apologize for his role in the financial manipulation. His inconsistency made it clear that he was struggling to understand his own feelings about the situation. "I know what they did was wrong," he told me during one of our more honest conversations. "But I don't know how to live without the money they were getting from you. I've never had to be completely responsible for myself. I don't even know where to start." Kevin's admission was both heartbreaking and infuriating. At 25, he had never developed basic life skills because my parents had used my money to enable his dependence. He wasn't malicious in the way my parents were. He was simply the product of a system that had taught him that his sister's success was his safety net. I offered to help Kevin develop a plan for financial independence, including assistance with job searching and budgeting, but he was resistant to anything that required sustained effort on his part. He wanted me to continue sending money while he gradually learned to be self-sufficient, a timeline that was conveniently indefinite, and would essentially maintain the status quo. "Just until I get on my feet," he pleaded, using the same language my parents had used for years. "I'm not asking for much, just enough to cover basics while I figure things out." But when I asked for specifics about his job search efforts or timeline for independence, his answers were vague and unconvincing. Eventually I realized that Kevin was no more ready to change the family dynamic than my parents were. He had benefited from the system just as much as they had, and he was equally invested in maintaining it. The difference was that his manipulation was more pitiful than calculating, but the end result was the same. Pressure for me to continue funding a lifestyle I could no longer afford to support. The decision to cut Kevin off financially was almost as difficult as the decision to cut off my parents. He was my little brother, and some part of me still felt responsible for his well-being. But drive. Martinez helped me understand that continuing to enable his dependence wasn't helping him. It was preventing him from developing the skills he needed to be a functional adult. "Sarah, you can't save someone who doesn't want to be saved," she explained. "Kevin has spent his entire adult life learning that someone else will solve his problems for him. As long as you continue to do that, he has no incentive to learn how to solve them himself. The kindest thing you can do is force him to develop his own capabilities." The advice was logical, but implementing it was emotionally brutal. Kevin's desperate phone calls and text messages were harder to ignore than my parents' angry ultimatums. When he called crying about being evicted from his apartment or having his utilities shut off, every instinct I had screamed at me to send money immediately. But I forced myself to offer alternatives. Information about social services, job placement agencies, roommate matching services, anything that would help him solve his problems without my financial intervention. 3 months after cutting off financial support to my family, I received an unexpected phone call from my Aunt Linda. Her tone was very different from our last conversation, and she had clearly learned information that changed her perspective on the family conflict. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," she began, her voice heavy with regret. "I've been talking to some other family members, and I'm starting to understand that the situation is much more complicated than your parents made it seem. Your cousin Maria told me some things about your student loans and the amount of money you've been sending home over the years. I had no idea." Maria, my cousin on my father's side, was a financial planner who had apparently done some investigation into my situation after hearing the family gossip. She had calculated that I had sent over $100,000 to my parents over the previous 5 years, money that could have paid off a significant portion of my student debt, or established a solid foundation for my own financial future. Pew. "Maria also looked into the house your parents want to buy," Aunt Linda continued. "She said they've been approved for a mortgage that they can afford on their own income, especially with the savings they already have. They don't actually need your money for the down payment. They just want it so they can keep their own savings intact." The confirmation from an objective family member that my parents' financial desperation was fabricated felt both validating and deeply sad. Maria's analysis had revealed what I had suspected but been afraid to acknowledge. My parents were not struggling. They were simply greedy. I'm ashamed that I believed their version of events without asking questions, Aunt Linda admitted. I should have realized that successful immigrants who've been working for 30 years wouldn't actually be as helpless as they claimed. I think I wanted to believe them because it fit the narrative of hard-working parents deserving support from successful children. Aunt Linda's apology opened the door to conversations with other extended family members who had begun questioning my parents' version of events. My cousin David, an accountant, had done his own analysis of my parents' financial situation and concluded that they were actually quite comfortable by most standards. Uncle Robert, my father's brother, had noticed inconsistencies between my parents' claims of poverty and their actual spending patterns. The gradual revelation that other family members were beginning to see through my parents' manipulation was both relieving and embarrassing. I was relieved that I wasn't completely alone in my perspective, but embarrassed that I had been so easily manipulated for so many years. If other people could see the inconsistencies in my parents' story, why had it taken me so long to recognize them? Dr. Martinez helped me understand that my position as the target of the manipulation had actually made it harder for me to see clearly. When you're inside an abusive system, especially one that starts in childhood, your perspective becomes distorted, she explained. The people manipulating you have years to condition your responses and normalize abnormal behavior. Outside observers often see the problems more clearly because they haven't been subjected to the same conditioning. As more family members began to understand the real dynamics of my situation, the social pressure that had initially supported my parents began to shift in my direction. My cousins who had previously criticized my selfishness started calling to express support for my decision to establish boundaries. Family friends who had been enlisted in the campaign to pressure me into compliance began questioning whether they had been given accurate information. The shift in family opinion was gratifying, but it also revealed how fragile my parents' narrative had been. Once people started asking questions and comparing notes, the inconsistencies became obvious. My parents had been successful in their manipulation, partly because they had controlled the flow of information, telling each family member just enough to generate sympathy without providing enough detail to raise questions. 6 months after my initial refusal to fund the house purchase, my parents' strategy changed dramatically. Instead of continuing to pressure me directly, they began attempting to circumvent my boundaries by creating new crises that they hoped would trigger my guilt and override my logical decision-making. The first manufactured crisis involved my father's health. My mother called to inform me that my father had been experiencing chest pains and needed expensive cardiac testing that their insurance wouldn't cover. The medical emergency was designed to exploit my professional knowledge and my emotional attachment to my father's well-being. He's been having episodes for weeks, my mother explained, her voice carefully calibrated to convey just the right amount of panic. The doctor wants to do a stress test and some other procedures, but we can't afford the copays. We need $3,000 immediately, or he might have a heart attack. The medical emergency felt different from their previous financial requests because it involved my father's health rather than their lifestyle preferences. For a moment my resolve wavered, and I almost offered to send the money immediately. But something about my mother's presentation felt rehearsed, and I decided to ask more questions before responding. Which doctor recommended these tests? I asked. What specific symptoms has Dad been having? What insurance issues are preventing coverage? My medical training had taught me to gather detailed information before making treatment decisions, and I applied the same principles to this family crisis. My mother's answers were vague and inconsistent. She couldn't remember the doctor's name or the specific tests that had been recommended. Her description of my father's symptoms changed slightly, each time she repeated it. When I offered to call the doctor's office directly to discuss payment options, she became defensive and evasive. "You don't trust us," she accused. "Your own father is having heart problems, and you're interrogating me like I'm a criminal." "Just send the money, Sarah. We can sort out the details later." The pressure to act quickly without asking questions was a classic manipulation tactic that I had learned to recognize in therapy. Real medical emergencies might require quick action, but they also involved verifiable information and legitimate healthcare providers. My mother's reluctance to provide details suggested that the emergency might not be as urgent or legitimate as she claimed. I told my mother that I would need to speak directly with my father and his healthcare provider before sending any money. Her reaction confirmed my suspicions that the emergency was not what it seemed. "Fine," she said, her voice shifting from panic to anger. "By the time you finish playing detective, your father could be dead. I hope you can live with yourself if something happens to him because you were too selfish to help." The emotional manipulation was so transparent that it felt almost insulting. My mother was literally trying to blame me for my father's potential death because I wanted to verify the details of his medical situation before sending thousands of dollars. The tactic was so extreme that it backfired, making me more suspicious rather than more compliant. When I finally spoke with my father directly, the truth about his medical situation was very different from my mother's dramatic presentation. He had mentioned some minor chest discomfort to his doctor during a routine visit, and the doctor had suggested some preventive tests that were covered by insurance. The tests weren't urgent, the symptoms weren't severe, and there were no immediate financial barriers to getting appropriate care. "Your mother sometimes worries more than necessary," my father admitted, when I pressed him for details. "The doctor said the tests are just precautionary." I probably should have been more clear with her about what the doctor actually said. The revelation that my mother had fabricated a medical emergency to extract money from me was a new low in our relationship. She had been willing to exploit my love for my father and my medical knowledge to manipulate me into sending money for a crisis that didn't exist. The calculated cruelty of using fake health emergencies as manipulation tools felt like a complete betrayal of any remaining trust I had in her. But the fake medical emergency was just the beginning of an escalating campaign of manufactured crises. Over the next few months, my family created a series of increasingly dramatic situations designed to test my resolve and find weaknesses in my boundaries. Kevin claimed to have been mugged and needed money to replace his stolen wallet and identification documents. When I offered to help him contact the police and navigate the bureaucratic process of replacing his documents, he became evasive and eventually admitted that he had actually just lost his wallet while drunk and made up the mugging story because he thought it would generate more sympathy. My mother reported that their apartment had been broken into and they needed money to replace stolen items and upgrade their security. When I asked for a police report number and offered to help them work with their insurance company, she claimed that they hadn't reported the break-in because they were worried about their immigration status affecting their relationship with law enforcement. The story fell apart when I pointed out that they had been citizens for over a decade and had no reason to fear police contact. Each manufactured crisis followed the same pattern: a dramatic initial presentation designed to trigger an emotional response, pressure to send money immediately without asking questions, and evasion or anger when I requested verification or offered alternative forms of help. The pattern was so consistent that I began to see it as a kind of formula my parents were using to test different approaches to manipulation. The most elaborate manufactured crisis came 8 months after my initial refusal to fund the house purchase. My mother called in tears to report that Kevin had been arrested on drug charges and needed bail money to avoid spending months in jail while awaiting trial. Months. "They want $10,000, she sobbed into the phone. "We don't have that kind of money, and Kevin says the public defender won't be able to get him out for weeks. He's scared, Sarah. He's never been in jail before, and he doesn't know how to survive in there. The scenario was designed to exploit multiple emotional triggers: my protective feelings toward Kevin, my fear of the criminal justice system, and my guilt about having withdrawn financial support that might have prevented him from getting into trouble. The amount of money was also significant enough to substantially impact my financial recovery, while being plausibly necessary for bail. But my experience with previous manufactured crises had taught me to verify information before responding emotionally. I told my mother that I would need the case number, the name of the jail where Kevin was being held, and contact information for his public defender before I could consider helping with bail. My mother's reaction was immediate and predictable. "There's no time for all that bureaucracy," she said. "Bail has to be posted today, or Kevin will lose his spot in the system and have to wait even longer. Just send the money now, and we can sort out the details later." The pressure to act without verification was the same tactic my mother had used during the fake medical emergency, and it immediately raised red flags. Real legal emergencies might require quick action, but they also involved verifiable documentation and legitimate court systems. I could easily confirm Kevin's arrest status by calling the jail directly. When I called the county jail and asked about Kevin's arrest status, I was told that no one by his name had been booked in the previous week. I expanded my search to neighboring counties and other possible variations of his name, but found no record of any arrest. Kevin wasn't in jail. He was at home, probably unaware that my mother was using his imaginary incarceration to try to extract money from me. The discovery that my mother had fabricated Kevin's arrest was the final straw in our relationship. She had been willing to lie about medical emergencies, home invasions, and now false imprisonment to manipulate me into sending money. The sophistication and cruelty of her lies had escalated to the point where she was creating elaborate fictional scenarios that exploited my deepest fears and most protective instincts. When I confronted my mother about the fake arrest, her response was unlike anything I had heard from her before. Instead of denying the lie or making excuses, she became coldly defensive and almost proud of her deception. "You forced me to do this," she said, her voice lacking any trace of remorse. "You cut us off without warning, leaving us to figure out how to survive without the money we were counting on. If I have to get creative to get what we need, that's your fault for being so selfish." The complete absence of guilt or shame in her voice was chilling. She had convinced herself that my refusal to fund their lifestyle justified any level of deception or manipulation. In her mind, she was the victim of my selfishness, and her lies were a form of justified retaliation rather than abusive behavior. "You think you can just abandon your family because you make good money now?" she continued, her voice becoming more bitter. "But family doesn't work that way. You owe us, Sarah. We created you. We invested in you, and now you belong to us. You can try to run away from that responsibility, but it will always be there." The language of ownership was particularly disturbing. My mother wasn't just claiming a right to my financial support. She was claiming ownership of my entire existence. In her mind, my success belonged to her because she had contributed to creating it, and my attempts to establish independence were a form of theft. "I don't belong to anyone," I told her, my voice steady despite the emotional turmoil I was feeling. "I'm not your property, I'm not your investment, and I'm not your retirement plan. I'm a separate person with my own life and my own responsibilities." "You're nothing without us," she replied, her voice venomous. "Everything you are, everything you've accomplished, you owe to this family. You think you can throw us away and build some new life, but you'll never escape what you really are. A selfish, ungrateful daughter who abandoned the people who loved her." The conversation ended with my mother's prediction that I would eventually come crawling back, begging for forgiveness, and offering to make up for my selfishness with even greater financial contributions. "You'll see," she said with cold certainty. "Life is harder than you think when you don't have family to fall back on. When you need us, we might not be here." I hung up the phone and realized that I felt relief rather than sadness. The woman on the phone wasn't my mother. She was a stranger who had been pretending to love me while systematically exploiting my affection and sense of obligation. The relationship I had been mourning had never actually existed. Over the following year, my life began to take shape in ways I had never imagined possible. Without the constant financial drain of supporting my family, I was able to make significant progress on my student loans, build a real emergency fund, and even start saving for goals that were purely my own rather than obligations to others. David and I moved in together, splitting expenses equally, in a way that felt both foreign and wonderful. For the first time in my adult life, I could afford to contribute my fair share to a shared household without sacrificing my own financial security. We began planning trips, discussing long-term goals, and building the kind of partnership I had always imagined, but never thought I could afford. The relationship with David deepened as I became more emotionally available. Without the constant stress of managing family financial crises and manufactured emergencies, I had energy for the kind of intimate conversations and shared experiences that build lasting relationships. David had been patient during my family crisis, but he admitted later that he had wondered whether I would ever be able to fully commit to our relationship while I was still enmeshed in my family's financial web. "You're a different person now," he told me one evening as we planned a weekend trip to Vermont. "You used to always seem like you were calculating something in your head, like you were doing math problems while we were talking. Now you're actually present when we're together." His observation made me realize how much mental energy I had been devoting to family financial management. Even during supposedly relaxing activities, I had been mentally tracking my account balances, calculating how much money I could afford to send home, and worrying about the next inevitable financial crisis. The liberation from that constant background stress was profound. I also discovered hobbies and interests that I had never had time or energy to pursue. I joined a hiking group and spent weekends exploring trails instead of working overtime to earn extra money for home. I took a cooking class and learned to make dishes that weren't chosen based on their cost per serving. I bought books for pleasure rather than just professional development, filling shelves with novels and poetry collections that serve no purpose other than my own enjoyment. The most surprising discovery was how much I enjoyed spending money on other people when it was my choice rather than an obligation. I bought thoughtful gifts for friends' birthdays, donated to causes I cared about, and even surprised David with weekend getaways that we planned together. Generosity felt completely different when it came from abundance rather than sacrifice. My work performance also improved dramatically once I was no longer constantly distracted by family financial crises. Dr. Sacht Rodriguez, my supervisor, noticed the change and commented on it during my annual review. "Sarah, I don't know what changes you've made in your personal life, but your focus and energy have improved significantly over the past year," she said. "You seem more confident, more decisive, and more present during patient interactions. Whatever you're doing, keep it up." The improvement in my professional performance was partly due to better sleep and reduced stress, but it was also due to a fundamental shift in how I saw myself. For the first time in my life, I was working to build my own career rather than to generate income for other people. My success belonged to me, and that ownership made me more invested in achieving it. A year and a half after cutting off financial support to my family, I received an unexpected phone call that would test everything I had learned about boundaries and manipulation. Kevin was calling from a hospital, and this time, his crisis was real.